Hello students of class 8. Welcome to today's English class. Today we will read Unit 1 of your English textbook Honeydew. This lesson unit will be done in two parts. In the first part, we will read the story The Best Christmas Present in the World and read a few comprehension questions on the story. In part 2, we will deal with the section Working with Language, some speaking activities and read the poem The Ant and the Cricket. Okay, are you ready? Shall we start? Now, look at the first page of the story, The Best Christmas Present in the World. Look there. There are some dates given to you in the textbook. Do you know what these dates are famous for? Look at the first one. 4th July 1976. Yes, you are right. That was the day America declared its independence. The second one, 17th December 1903. Yes, you are right. That was the day when the Wright brothers, Wilbur and Orville, made their first flight. C. 6th August 1945. Do you know what happened on that day? Yes, a horrible thing. An atom bomb was dropped on Hiroshima in Japan during the World War II. D. 30th January 1948. I'm sure you all know that. That was the day Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated. Okay, try the next two later. Now, let us go to our story. Our story today, The Best Christmas Present in the World, is also related to another very important historical event of the 20th century, and that is the First World War. Do you know when the First World War happened? Yes, it happened between the year 1914 and 1918 in Europe. Here is a clipping from the war. Just have a look at it. Did you get a feel of the terrible war? Yes. Now let's go to our story. In the story, our author, Michael Morpurgo, once went to a junk shop to buy an old roll-top desk. He found a very good one, an oak desk, 19th century made, but it was way too expensive and he couldn't buy it. He saw another one which was not so good. It was broken in parts, burnt down in parts, but it was cheap. So the author thought of buying this table and mend it for his use later. The next day, it was the Christmas Eve, and the author sat down to repair this broken desk. There were parts of the desk that was burnt and damaged by water. There was one drawer, the lowermost one, which was stuck. He couldn't just remove it. After some time, he applied a lot of force and forced the drawer to come off. What does he find there? There is another secret drawer inside that drawer. And in that secret drawer, there is a small tin box. Out of curiosity, the author takes out that tin box. And what does he find? On the tin box, on a piece of paper, sellotaped, is written, "The letter received from Jim on 25th January 1915, to be buried with me when the time comes." Oh, the author was very curious. He opened the box and found an envelope addressed to Mrs. Jim Macpherson, 12 Copper Beeches, Bridford. The author knew it wasn't good to open somebody else's letter, but he could not just wait to find out what was there inside. He opened the letter and found here was a letter dated 26th December 1914 and written in a pencil. Now, look at the questions on page 10, the comprehension check. What did the author find in a junk shop? Yes, of course, you know that. The author found a 19th century old roll-top desk which was put up for sale in the junk shop. It was in a very bad condition with several broken pieces clumsily mended, and there were burnt marks all over. Right. The second question, what did he find in a secret drawer? Who do you think had put it in there? Yes, you know that. The author found a secret drawer which had a small tin box. On the box was written on a piece of paper, Jim's last letter, received January 25, 1915, to be buried with me when the time comes. It seems that the letter was put inside the box by Mrs. Macpherson and kept carefully there. Now, let us go to the second part of the story, the actual letter that Jim Macpherson wrote to his wife from the battlefield. Dearest Connie, I write to you in a much happier frame of mind because something wonderful has just happened that I must tell you about at once. We were all standing to in our trenches yesterday morning, Christmas morning. It was crisp and quiet all about. As beautiful a morning as I've ever seen, as cold and frosty as a Christmas morning should be. I should like to be able to tell you that we began it, but the truth, I'm ashamed to say, is that Fritz began it. What do you think Fritz began? A war or firing? Who is Fritz, by the way? Fritz is a common German name, and in this context, it is used to suggest a German soldier who was on the opposite side of the battlefield. Now, what did Fritz begin? As Jim and his soldiers were in the trenches, they found one German soldier waving a white flag. A white flag? What does that mean? It means peace. So what is it? Is the war over? No, not yet. But here was this German soldier walking up out of his trenches and coming towards the English soldiers. Now, what are trenches? Yes, just look at the picture. Trenches are long, narrow ditches. The soldiers during World War I would stand inside the trenches to safeguard themselves and also to fire at their enemies. So, what happened in the story next? There was one or two German soldiers getting slightly out of their trenches, loudly wished the English soldiers Happy Christmas. The English soldiers wished back. But it did not stop at that. There were more number of soldiers getting out of the trenches, marching towards the no man's land with a white flag in hand. What is no man's land? When two armies fight face to face, there is one part of land which is like a border. Nobody crosses that. And here were German soldiers walking towards no man's land in so many numbers. Probably it is just a trick. They are going to come there and then start firing. No, it wasn't that. Just at that time, there was another soldier who came out with a bottle in hand and said, "We have schnapps, we have sausage. We meet you, today is Christmas." Oh, they were surprised, the English soldiers. There was a dozen German soldiers who marched towards the no man's land with no rifle in hand. By then, there were some of the English soldiers who went out of their trenches. They were walking towards the no man's land too. Jim was the officer, and before he understood what was happening, there were soldiers in grey coats and khaki coats, Germans and British, meeting at the no man's land and wishing each other Happy Christmas. Here was the best Christmas celebration amidst a terrible war. Celebration between so-called enemies. Jim too went out and met the German officer Hans Wolf. He shook hands with him and wished him Happy Christmas. Hans Wolf said he was a cello player and is from Dusseldorf in Germany. Jim shook hands with him and introduced himself as a teacher in Dorset. The moment Jim said the word Dorset, Hans Wolf's face brightened up. He seemed to have known that place. Maybe he was there sometime? Let us find out. As they talked to each other, Hans Wolf told Jim that his favorite English author was Thomas Hardy. Have you heard of him? Yes, he's a great novelist. And Hans's favorite English novel was Far from the Madding Crowd. Hans had never been to England, but learnt all about Dorset from Hardy's novels. So, on Christmas morning, Jim and Hans sat together discussing Gabriel Oak, Bathsheba, characters from the novel. They also talked about their families back at home. Hans had a wife and a son. Around these two men, there were German and English soldiers eating, drinking, talking, smoking, enjoying a Christmas day. Suddenly, somebody took out a football, and the English and the German soldiers dropped their coats on either side, heaped them up as goalposts, and started to play a friendly match. Just imagine, in between this terrible war, the two armies playing a great match of football. Jim and Hans watched them, cheered them, clapped, and were really very, very happy. Suddenly, Hans made a very, very important observation. He said, "How wonderful it would be if the nations resolved their conflicts in a friendly match. In a match, nobody dies, no child becomes orphan, no woman becomes a widow. There is no suffering, there is no loss. How wonderful that would be." What a wonderful idea! If only the world understood this, there would be no wars, no destruction, no misery, no pain, no loss of property or life. How wonderful that would be. Now back to our story. The Frids, or the Germans, won the match. Probably, if it would be a cricket match, the British would have won. As the game was over and the day passed by, the soldiers gradually went back to their respective camps. They wished the war was over soon and they were all back with their families. Hans and Jim wished each other and hoped that they would be back with their families soon. That night, back in our dugouts, we heard them singing a carol, singing it quite beautifully. It was still night, silent night. Our boys gave them a rousing chorus of "While Shepherds Watched." We exchanged carols for a while and then we all fell silent. We had had our time of peace and goodwill, a time I will treasure as long as I live. Dearest Connie, by Christmas time next year, this war will be nothing but a distant and terrible memory. I know from all that happened today how much both armies long for peace. We shall be together again soon, I'm sure of it. Your loving Jim. Okay, excellent story. Did you like the story? All right. Now, let us look at the comprehension check questions on page 14. Question 1. Who had written the letter, to whom and when? Yes, you know that. Captain Jim Macpherson of the British Army, who was fighting a war against the Germans, had written the letter to his wife Connie on 26 December 1914. Question 2. Why was the letter written? What was the wonderful thing that had happened? You know that. Jim Macpherson wrote this letter to tell his wife the wonderful event that happened on the day of Christmas. Although a war was on, the two armies, the English and the Germans, celebrated Christmas and played a football match together. Question 3. What jobs did Hans Wolff and Jim Macpherson have when they were not soldiers? Yes, before joining the army, Jim Macpherson was a school teacher in Dorset and Hans Wolff was a cello player in the orchestra at Dusseldorf, Germany. Right. Try the next two questions 4 and 5 at home later. Now, let's read the third part of the story. Let's get back to our author. He read this letter and decided he will go and meet Mrs. Macpherson and return the letter. Next morning, on Christmas morning, he went to 12 Copper Beeches, Dorset. When he reached the house, he found it was partly burnt down. There was hardly anything remaining of the house. He went to the next door and knocked at that door. An old man came out. When the author asked about Mrs. Macpherson, the old man said, "Oh, I knew her all my life. She was a lovely lady, but a little muddle-headed. But anyway, she was 101 years old, and it is natural to be a little muddle-headed. She wasn't in the house after the house burnt and the firemen saved her. She started to live in the Burlington House nursing home far away." The author decided to go to the nursing home to meet Mrs. Macpherson. As he went to this nursing home, Burlington House, he found Christmas celebrations were on. Everybody was in a festive mood. The matron told him that Mrs. Macpherson was not too good that day. She was a little confused and needed rest, and therefore she was not in the group of people who were celebrating. The author was taken to where Mrs. Macpherson was. She was sitting in a wheelchair. The author wished her Happy Christmas and showed her the tin box. She looked at his face, trying to read something, and looked suddenly happy. The author took out the letter and gave it to her in her hand. Her eyes were almost filled with tears. She took the letter in her hand and started stroking it tenderly. The author tried to explain to her how he had found it, but it did not seem that Mrs. Macpherson was listening to anything that the author said. She kept looking at his face with that look of happiness on her face. And then suddenly she said, "You told me he would come home by Christmas, and you are here. This is the best Christmas present in the world. Jim dear, come near and sit down." What do you think is happening? Yes, Mrs. Macpherson thinks that this author, the visitor, is her husband, Jim, come back from the battle. She even told him that she has made a cake, a marzipan, that her husband liked so much. That's all is the story. Did you like it? Yes, a nice story. Now, let us look at the comprehension check on page 16. Question 1. Who did Connie Macpherson think her visitor was? Yes, we know that. Connie Macpherson thought the visitor to be her husband, Jim. Question 2. Which sentence in the text shows that the visitor did not try to hide his identity? We have this sentence, "I found this. I think it is yours." And also, "I explained about the desk and how I had found it." Okay, let's now go to the section working with the text. There are some questions and we'll try to answer them. Question 1. For how long do you think Connie had kept Jim's letter? Give reasons for your answer. Connie had kept Jim's letter from 25th January 1915 till the time the desk was sold to the junk shop. We understand this as she said she used to read the letter every day and could feel Jim's presence around her. Question 2. Why do you think the desk had been sold and when? The desk probably would have been sold after the house burnt down and Mrs. Macpherson shifted to the nursing home. Why do Jim and Hans think that games or sports are good ways of resolving conflicts? Do you agree? Jim and Hans thought sports was a good way of resolving conflicts between countries because in a match nobody dies, no children become orphans, no women become widows, nobody lays down their lives. There is no destruction, no pain, no death in a friendly match. Do you agree with this? Yes, I agree. How wonderful it would be if the nations agreed to resolve their conflicts this way. Question number 4. Do you think the soldiers of the two armies are like each other or different from each other? Find evidence from the story to support your answer. Yes, of course. The two armies were very similar. Though the Germans started it, even the British soldiers joined them in celebrating Christmas amidst this terrible war. The soldiers shared whatever food and drink they had and enjoyed. They also played the friendly match, and at the end of the match, they all agreed that this war was terrible and they all longed to go back home to their families. Try the other questions at home later. Let us now go to the last section here called writing. Look at the activities that are given to you. Imagine that you are Jim. You have returned to your town after the war. In your diary, record how you feel about the changes you see and the events that occur in your town. Look at this picture of the city devastated by the war. You can take ideas from this picture to write your diary. You can start your diary as written on 25th December 1919. It's Christmas today, but the town looks, and you can continue. There is another writing activity for you in question 2. There is an outline of a story. Try to connect the events in the outline and make up your story. Try these 2 activities at home later. With this, we come to the end of part 1 of Unit 1. Here are a few more pictures of war for you. I'm sure the pictures of the war are not pleasant at all. It is said that wars are the greatest plague in the world that destroys lives, destroys nations, destroys generations. Can we all think of a different way of resolving conflicts? Think about it. Okay, so part 1 is over. See you next time for part 2. Till then, goodbye. Thank you.